I've narrowed my list down to 10, but it doesn't mean that this list is exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. Let's get into the surprising aspects that I've experienced with sewing. And welcome to Dine In Creativity, or welcome back if you're returning. I'm Rachel Ann, and I'm here to share all about my sewing journey, the highs, the lows, aka what I've learned, and actually sometimes I really do share the lows of the experience, which kind of factors into this list today because sewing has been such a great adventure for me. It's truly a journey, and today I had to sit down with the end of the year coming sooner rather than later at this point, which is always shocking to me how quickly it sneaks up on us. I wanted to kind of sit down and compile a list of some very surprising effects that I've come across from starting my sewing journey about 2.5 years ago. Feel free to go look at my other videos if you're new here, just to kind of see where I started, where I am now. I am still constantly learning. But one thing is for sure, I have kind of experienced these 10 different after effects from sewing. So it goes without saying, please share if you have noticed different after effects from sewing that maybe I didn't cover today, or even if you relate. I would love to hear in the comments what you think about these. Okay, the first one, by and large, believe it or not, was very surprising to me, is that I haven't, and you may not, continue to look at clothing in the store the same way. Your relationship to store-bought clothing may change. This was very surprising to me because I've always been a shopper, albeit a frugal shopper. I've always liked to make my money stretch. I've always liked to find the best deal, but it's almost cranked up a notch with a sewing mindset. Even if it is a garment I see in the store that I like, if I think that I can make it or I can make it, I'm not gonna buy it from the store. It's always surprising to me now when I go shopping, the lens at which I view the clothing, the store-bought clothing with. This was very surprising, like I shared. I had no idea that this would be an after effect of beginning to sew my own garments, and even in my own closet, when I go in to assess what do I want to wear for that day, I always gravitate towards the section of my closet that has been hand sewn, because typically these are unique fabrics to me. They are patterns that I've carefully chosen, and then of course they've all been fitted to my exact body specifications and the way I like clothes to look and hang on my body. It also is surprising to me how high clothing is marked up when you go into a store. I mean, seeing a very simple, silky material, not even real silk or authentic silk, seeing a silky material shirt being sold for well over $50 when you could find a similar fabric and pattern for probably a fraction of that price. This doesn't always mean that sewing is less expensive. I'm going to get to that in a future point. It's just meant to show how your mindset can shift. If this is something that you too have experienced, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. The second thing that has been a surprising after effect, which it really shouldn't be surprising, but I just want to put it out there to normalize that this happens, you will, and I've got my list here, you will experience the inevitable frustration of accidentally sewing something on incorrectly, but hopefully will learn to laugh at yourself in the corrective process. Just last night, I was sewing a new pair of pajamas and I accidentally sewed the sleeve on wrong so that the right side and the wrong sides of the fabric weren't lined up. I don't know how I did that. I think I was just kind of listening to a podcast or zoning out, but all I could do was just laugh, rip all those seams out, and sew it on correctly. So you will experience the inevitable frustration that comes from that. But the other piece I've learned, especially being somebody who is a perfectionist and very type A, You learn to laugh. You're not on a deadline. You're in your creative flow. No one is necessarily judging your piece except for you. And really the only thing that matters is whether or not you actually like the garment. So laugh it off. You will learn though that frustration is kind of part of the process. The third surprising after effect that I've personally experienced, again, always curious to hear if you have felt the same way, was the feeling of just being liberated. You have the freedom to create whatever you want to create. Pick the colors, the fabric choice, the style, and it's freeing. No longer are you kind of bound by what's available to you in a specific store, but instead you do get to create something from the ground up and walk away with a garment that you adore. So I can remember shopping in the store and thinking, this fit is a little funky, but I'll try to make it work. And I found that there were many times where I never did make that garment actually work. I just at the time didn't know how to sew, did not know how to alter the clothing. So a garment would just hang in my closet for infinity and beyond. But now learning how to measure my body and embrace the certain fabrics and styles that I personally love, it's a game changer. Not to mention, I feel like it goes without saying, you're no longer confined to these crazy all over the place sizes that come your way depending on which store you go to. I mean, you can go to one store, you'll be one size there. You'll go to another store, you'll be 2 sizes bigger or 2 sizes smaller. It's all over the map. So instead, with sewing, it's liberating. It's freeing in that you do get to kind of create what it is that you want to create. I kind of laugh at myself for this one, but it's just true to the journey in life, which that's kind of another surprising after effect of sewing that I've come to learn and realize. This is just like a tangent really quick. A lot of the sewing journey and the sewing process mimics life, and they say art imitates life. I definitely agree with that phrase, because the other surprising after effect that you will learn with sewing, the learning never ends. Now, I know that that's not surprising coming from somebody who, in the big scheme of life, is a novice, very new, 2.5 years in maybe. That's super new, but the learning really never stops. I mean, I remember sewing up some of my earlier pieces and thinking, this is it. I am, this is my peak. And then starting another project that really tested my skills and thinking, oh my gosh, I think I just unlocked another level, and so on and so forth. And sometimes, even though you feel like you've taken 3 steps forward, 2 steps forward, the inevitable realizing you still have so much to learn kind of strikes up again in you. And so the process of sewing is very humbling, but you do realize that the learning never fully stops, at least in my opinion. Again, this is coming from somebody who's new, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially if you've been sewing for several decades. Do you find that there are still new techniques, that there are still new ways of working with fabric and things of that nature? I would just be so curious to hear you weigh in. Okay, so this next one, you may set out in your sewing journey to try to save money, and I will share that part of my desire to learn to sew was rooted in my own frugality and never being one to just drop a ton of money on designer clothing or anything of that nature. So one of my kind of underlying reasons was I thought, this is a great way to save money. I'll spend $7 a yard on fabric, so that's $14 for 2 yards. But then you kind of don't take into account that certain projects call for certain other materials, especially when you're first starting out. You need to get the matching thread, different kinds of needles, the sewing machine itself. Sometimes there is sew-in interfacing. Just insert whatever supplies start to come up. But then you realize there are ways to make sewing so much easier. So let me invest in good scissors, a rotary cutter, a self-healing mat, so on and so forth. So even if you are a bargain fabric hunter and shopper like I am, I love finding a bargain. I love that thrill of the hunt. You do come to realize that by the time you factor in the amount of time it actually takes to sew up a garment, you're kind of breaking even in a way. However, the after effects of creating your own piece are just so much more plentiful or empowering than, in my opinion, just going and picking something off of a rack at a store and bringing it home. So you see the scales here kind of end up weighing each other out, if that makes sense. This has been a surprising reinforcement to, in my opinion, a psychological effect when it comes to sewing. And that is, I mean, the same with anything in life, but you really will learn to make time to do what you love. That's always been kind of a case for me in the hobbies that I've liked to engage in the past. And if you don't make time for it, the beautiful fabric that a person has just purchased will just sit there forever and not be made into something gorgeous. So you really learn to kind of take advantage of the time and space that you have in your life. I know we're all busy, work full time, or you've got families and insert whatever. But in order to really cash in on the beautiful effects that sewing can bring, you do have to make time for it. So I've really learned that even if I have 30 minutes in between whatever I'm doing, it's just enough time to maybe iron the hem, pin it in place, and then I'll come back later and actually sew the hem. So not only is a surprising after effect of reinforcing a person to actually make time to do what it is you love, you do get to learn problem-solving skills, time management, all that good stuff. I think this is number 7, but perhaps one of the most important pieces that and surprising after effects is that and I speak from my experience with this video, obviously, but you will oftentimes learn more from the mistakes that you make versus the pieces that are really straightforward and easy to sew up. I instantly think about pajamas because I've been sewing up a lot of loungewear lately, and it's pretty straightforward. You know, I feel like I'm kind of reinforcing skills that I already have, maybe learning to work a little bit better with some knit fabrics, things of that nature. But overall, most of my learning has come from challenging myself to up-level my skill, to take on a project that I've never done before, that I don't really have any experience in, that I make the most mistakes in and have to pull out the most seams or learn, okay, that collar, this is why it didn't work when I attached it this way, versus those straightforward and easier projects. So learn from the mistakes, don't beat yourself up for them, but truly that's where I think the richness lies in the sewing journey, is sewing up the more difficult pieces, learning the takeaways, and breaking out the easier pieces for when you need a break after all of that learning has just happened. Let's put it that way. Okay, this one's kind of a cheat, surprising after effect, but it's actually something I learned from doing commissioned art pieces. So for the majority of my life, I absolutely was an oil and acrylic painter. And I still am, although sewing is kind of taken over at this point. It's my newest kind of creative outlet that I adore. But if you start monetizing your creative hobby, it can cause you to start to view it differently. And that's why, believe it or not, I have had a couple people ask me if I would sew them up a pair of pants that I had made. And had to edit this in very quickly because I thought you would get a kick out of it. And maybe this has happened to you, but several times when I have been purchasing fabric from Joann's or any fabric stores, folks have asked me, oh, what are you making? And would you be interested in sewing curtains or sewing seat covers for my outdoor cushions, things of that nature? And it showed me that there is a high need for sewists. However, I've really come up with a response at this point where I just let someone know, you know, right now, this is really just something I'm doing for fun, for a creative hobby, because I just know from that previous experience that it can slightly remove the joy. You learn to say no, and so I encourage you to consider, how would I respond if somebody asks me to start sewing clothing items for them? Is this something I really want to embark on? I think everybody should at least try, if you have an interest. And I could be totally wrong. You could end up making an entire clothing brand because you love it so much. But that's just been my experience. When you monetize a creative hobby, it turns into a job. So it no longer just becomes this creative flow state. You've kind of, at least I do, I have the customer in the back of my head, and it can almost inhibit slightly. Again, that's my experience. I'd be interested to hear what you think. Last but not least, this has by and large been a huge part of my sewing journey. Is you will hopefully learn to embrace the journey instead of just the final product. Sometimes, and this was also reinforced when I did painting primarily, sometimes you have something in your mind and you think this is what I want it to look like, and your expectation does not match reality. And so it's a good test in learning to be fluid and flexible and embracing the journey of creating versus becoming too laser focused on that end product and ending up maybe becoming so frustrated that you just scrap the whole thing because it's not turning out the way you want it to. That's the really fun part about sewing, in my opinion, is that, well, the fun part and the irritating / frustrating part, let's be honest, but that's kind of the range of emotions that can come from sewing, is learning to problem solve. Think critically about, how do I flip this garment into something that I actually want to wear, and let go of all of these high expectations that I might be placing on myself to get it to be exactly how I want it to be. So it's a really nice practice, and just being flexible, and flexibility in life can just very much serve a person well, because as you may know watching, the only thing constant in life is change. And what happens in the sewing room is a tiny social microcosm, I believe, of what can happen big picture. Oh my gosh, I'm being such a therapist right now with these tips, but I really have found that. So now I gotta throw it out to you. What would you add to this list? What have been some other observations in your sewing journey? I have seen time and time again that the sewing journey, the lessons just are endless. So please feel free to share what you've learned along your sewing journey and any surprising after effects that you've noticed from teaching yourself to sew or being taught to sew, or just your sewing journey in general. I do have what I think is going to be a fun video to show you for next week. I'm just finishing up a couple garments to kind of really complete the video, but hopefully you'll find that handy for this winter season that we're currently in. So stay tuned. Feel free to subscribe if you would like to join me on my sewing channel. It really does mean a lot when people subscribe, like, and comment. I try to respond to every comment, and I am so appreciative and grateful to you who take the time to share your thoughts and comments. I always say this, I feel like, but I do continue to pick up tips and information from people who comment. So thank you so much, as well as other YouTube sewists and creators. So as always, thanks again for being here. Take really good care of yourself. Happy creating, creative process, and be well.